Hola? What's the weather like where you are today? Sunny, rainy, cloudy? Comment below.
I always thought the worst way to find out you're not wanted is silence. But I was wrong. The worst way is a group email, one you were never meant to see, with a reply thread that says, and I quote, "Let's keep it lean, only the top performing folks this year. Claire's numbers were average. This is a celebration for winners." That sentence, with its smug little period at the end, landed in my inbox by mistake. Probably someone hit reply all without checking. A 23-year-old junior account manager forwarded it to me, probably thinking she was doing me a favor. Or maybe she was just too clueless to know what she was stirring up. At 46, I've spent more than half my adult life at this company. I was here when we worked out of a converted warehouse in Dayton with drafty windows and desks made of plywood. I sat in that ice-cold space with gloves on, building campaigns from scratch, while the founders pitched to investors who thought we were just another flash-in-the-pan marketing agency. I stayed when others left. I trained interns who went on to become VPs. I swallowed my pride more times than I can count, smiled through meetings where my ideas were recycled and served up by someone louder, younger, or with a better golf swing. And now, after everything, after nearly 2 decades of sweat and loyalty, I get disinvited from a party where they're handing out trophies to people I mentored. People who wouldn't know a strategy if it bit them in the rear. I sat at my desk that Thursday afternoon, rereading the email, trying to process the gut punch of it. I wasn't even angry at first. That came later. What I felt in that moment was something colder, an ache, like a long bruise finally being pressed. It wasn't about missing some party with charcuterie boards and bad wine. It was about being erased, made invisible, as if everything I'd done, everything I'd sacrificed, suddenly didn't count. I could have marched down the hall, slammed doors, demanded answers. I could have pulled rank, called in favors, made them squirm, but I didn't. I closed the email, leaned back in my chair, and stared at the wall of my office. A wall that, by the way, I paid to repaint myself last year after management cut the budget for renovations. I let the silence stretch. And then, very slowly, I reached for my phone and ordered Chinese takeout. Kung Pao chicken, extra spicy. The same order I always made when I needed to remind myself I was still in control of something, anything. Now here's where it gets interesting. About 15 minutes after the email debacle, I got a notification. Not from HR, not from the CEO's assistant, but from my personal inbox. A single line from my lawyer. "Contract is ready, waiting for your signature." See, while the rest of them were busy jockeying for praise and perfecting their LinkedIn humble brags. I'd been working on something else entirely, a quiet deal, a long game. Months of after-hours Zoom calls, whispered meetings in neutral cafes, NDAs that could make a man's head spin. I wasn't chasing applause, I was laying groundwork. And if it worked, if the ink dried on that contract, it would change everything, not just for me, for the entire company. They didn't even know it yet. And honestly, I kind of liked that. Let them have their little celebration with their gold balloons and ego stroking. Let them clink glasses and pat each other on the back for record quarterly sales I practically handed to them with a silver spoon. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That night, while they were probably toasting themselves at some rooftop bar, I was at home in my pajamas, sitting cross-legged on my couch with chopsticks in one hand, and my laptop in the other. The food was good, not great, but reliable. Just like me, I suppose. I clicked open the contract, scanned through it one last time, and when I hit the final page, I didn't hesitate. I typed my full name, slowly, deliberately, and pressed send. Right after that, I did something I hadn't done in a long time. I laughed. Not out of joy, not quite. It was more like a release, a quiet acknowledgement that for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to give me permission to matter. They made it very clear I wasn't a winner, that I didn't belong at the table, and I believed them for a long time. But that night, something shifted. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, intentional. And it started with an empty inbox, a cold dinner, and a deal that none of them saw coming. Tomorrow, they'll wake up to a headline that changes the game, but tonight, they can enjoy their trophies. They earned them. After all, this was a celebration for winners. There's something painfully poetic about eating Chinese takeout alone on a Thursday night, while you know, because the silence screams it, that the people you've worked beside for nearly 20 years are laughing over cocktails and steak tartare at a downtown rooftop you're not welcome at. Even though your fingerprints are on every damn slide in the company pitch deck, they're all raising their glasses too. I didn't need a camera crew or an invitation to know exactly what that night looked like. I could picture every detail: the CEO's awkward toast that somehow made it about him, the sycophants clapping a beat too late, the exec team with their forced laughs and stiff suits, and a few of the newer faces pretending to be surprised when they won awards for work. I quietly coached them through. I imagined someone mentioning my name, probably just once, with a half shrug and a, well, Claire had some input, I guess. And then the conversation quickly shifting back to safer ground, to people who played the game better, louder, slicker. The takeout bag was still warm when I got home, and the air inside my apartment smelled faintly of the lavender candle I always lit when I needed to feel like I had control over something, anything, even if it was just the scent of my own living room. I opened the box, stirred the noodles around with the little plastic fork, and sat there staring at the steam rising like it might hold some answer I hadn't figured out yet. And maybe it's sad, or maybe it's just brutally honest, but I didn't cry, I didn't rant, I didn't call anyone to vent. What I felt was a kind of stillness I hadn't experienced in years. A strange, sharp awareness that everything I'd poured into my work, the late nights, the missed birthdays, the weekend sacrifice for campaigns that made someone else look brilliant, had led me to this moment, this lonely dinner, this crystal clear understanding that they were never going to let me in. Not really. You spend enough years in a system that rewards volume over value, charm over competence, and you start to convince yourself that maybe you just don't sparkle enough. Maybe your contributions are too quiet. Maybe the only way to win is to become someone else entirely. Someone who plays dumb in meetings so the boss can feel smart. Someone who smiles when credit is handed to the intern you trained. Someone who nods along while decisions are made in rooms you're not invited into, even when they impact the work you built from scratch. I'd done all of that, more times than I can count. And I think that night, as I slurped those greasy noodles and scrolled through social media photos of the party I wasn't at, it hit me. I was done trying to earn a seat at a table that was never built for someone like me in the first place. Because here's the twist no one at that celebration knew, and this is the part that still makes me smile. Not out of spite, but something deeper, something like relief. I hadn't spent the last 6 months chasing approval or climbing ladders that led nowhere. I'd been building something else, quietly, methodically, with the kind of focus that comes when you finally stop waiting for permission to matter. The deal I'd signed that night, it wasn't just a win for me. It was a pivot point, a seismic shift, a licensing agreement with a tech partner that would open up an entirely new revenue stream for the company. I wasn't just part of the deal, I was the deal. I had negotiated every clause, worked through every revision, and structured it so precisely that when it went public, there would be no mistaking who made it happen. Still, that night, I said nothing. I didn't forward the signed contract to the CEO. I didn't text anyone a smug message. I just let them toast their imaginary triumphs while I sat with my food and my silence, knowing the real celebration hadn't happened yet. I think people assume revenge has to be loud, dramatic, maybe even cruel. But the truth is, sometimes the sweetest revenge is just success they can't take credit for. Success they didn't see coming because they were too busy pretending you didn't exist. And here's something I want to ask you. Yes, you watching this. Have you ever been in that place where you realize, not in a burst of anger, but in the slow, bitter clarity of a quiet night, that the people you trusted, the ones who said you were part of the team, were never actually rooting for you? That all along, they were just tolerating you, using you, or worse, ignoring you entirely? I want to know. drop it in the comments, even if it's just a few words. Because the truth is, a lot of us have been there. And most of us never say it out loud. That night ended not with a bang, but with a quiet moment of resolve. I put my leftover noodles in the fridge, turned off the lights, and stood by my bedroom window for a long time, watching the city hum beneath me. Somewhere out there, my colleagues were probably still laughing, still tipsy, still congratulating each other on a job well done. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet was already shifting, that tomorrow, everything they thought they controlled would look very different. And I slept better than I had in years. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was already seeping through the blinds in long golden slats across the hardwood floor, casting a kind of indifferent beauty over the quiet stillness of my apartment. And for a few brief seconds, I forgot what day it was, forgot what had happened the night before, forgot that somewhere, a handful of colleagues I once trusted were probably nursing hangovers and sore cheeks from fake smiles, until my phone buzzed twice in rapid succession and jolted me back into the world I was still very much a part of, a world that, unbeknownst to them, was about to tilt on its axis. The notifications weren't from anyone I knew personally. Not at first. The first was a breaking news alert from a tech industry blog I had followed for years, but never interacted with. And the second was from a financial news aggregator app I'd installed months ago during a sleepless night when I needed to feel like I was still in the loop. Both headlines told the same story, though dressed in slightly different language. My deal had gone live, and the world was paying attention. I stared at the screen, watching the words settle into focus, and there it was in clean, bold type. Midwest-based marketing firm secures historic licensing agreement with emerging AI innovator projected to triple revenue by Q4. I blinked once, then again, as if my eyes were playing a trick on me. Even though I'd been the one to pull the strings, set the meetings, push through the doubts, and craft the damn narrative in the first place. It wasn't vanity that made me scroll. It was something deeper, something closer to disbelief. Because for so long, I'd operated in the shadows, solving problems others didn't see coming, protecting the company from disaster, while they danced around with half-formed strategies and empty buzzwords. And now, in the cold, clinical voice of business journalism, my work was finally being acknowledged. Not by name, of course, because I had insisted on confidentiality during the initial phase of the rollout, but the timing, the language, and the structure of the deal were unmistakably mine. I padded into the kitchen, the floor cool beneath my feet, and made coffee with the kind of careful, mechanical motion that comes only when your body knows you're processing something too big for immediate reaction. The phone buzzed again, this time a text, from someone I hadn't spoken to in weeks. Madison, our VP of brand strategy, the same woman who had once told me in a conference room full of junior staffers that my approach was too cautious for modern clients. Her message was short, breezy, and utterly transparent. "Hey Claire, big congrats, so exciting. We should catch up soon. Coffee?" I laughed, not out of joy, but with a dry, almost hollow amusement, because it hadn't even been 8 hours since she was probably sipping overpriced wine on that rooftop, completely unaware that the woman they left off the guest list was about to make their celebratory press release look like a footnote. As the minutes passed, the ripple turned into a wave. LinkedIn buzzed with reshared articles, vague humble brags from executives who clearly hadn't read the full deal brief, and more than a few half-hearted attempts to frame the win as a team effort, which was particularly rich considering most of them didn't even know the partner company's name until they read it in the press. My inbox lit up next, flooded with internal emails titled, "Amazing News," and "Let's Discuss," from people who hadn't looked me in the eye in weeks, maybe months. I didn't respond to any of them, not out of malice, but because I had no interest in explaining what they should have known already. That you can't ignore someone for years and then pretend you've been cheering them on from the sidelines. The real kicker came just before noon, when my office line rang, and the name that popped up on the screen made me pause, hand hovering over the receiver. It was him. David Mercer, CEO, founder, the man who used to call me kiddo in meetings. Even though I was 5 years his senior and had built 3 of our most successful client relationships from scratch, I didn't pick up. I let it ring out, watched the call roll to voicemail, and then immediately received a follow-up email. Claire, just saw the announcement. Incredible work. We need to talk ASAP. Can you swing by the office this afternoon? The tone was professional, but the subtext was practically vibrating with panic. He had no idea how I'd pulled it off, who I'd worked with, or what leverage I might be sitting on. And in that moment, with my coffee cooling beside me, and the city starting to hum with its late morning rhythm, I realized something that caught me off guard. I didn't feel victorious. Not yet, because for all the headlines and sudden attention, this wasn't the win. This was just the trigger, the setup. The match struck against the baka. What came next? That was the fire. So I dressed deliberately that day, not in the neutral palette I'd come to adopt over years of wanting to blend in, but in something bold. A cobalt blue blouse with structured shoulders, a pair of tailored black slacks, heels that clicked purposefully on every hallway tile. I walked into the office without fanfare, without a single word, letting my presence do what words never could. And as I passed the reception desk, I saw Madison look up from her screen, eyes widening slightly before she pasted on that tight, professional smile people reserve for moments when they realize they've miscalculated. I said nothing. I walked straight to my office, closed the door, and turned off my notifications. Let them sweat. There's a particular kind of theater that unfolds when people begin to realize they've underestimated someone, especially in the corporate world, where power isn't always wielded through shouting matches or dramatic declarations, but through silence, precision, and an unnerving ability to withhold exactly what others are scrambling to understand. The morning after the news broke, when I stepped into the office building with my back straight and my eyes steady, I knew without a doubt that the balance had shifted, not through any announcement I had made, but through the ripple effect of their own confusion, their questions, and the slow, creeping realization that something monumental had occurred without their involvement, input, or even awareness. And the most beautiful part was that I didn't have to say a word, because the silence was speaking volumes for me. By the time I reached my floor, the atmosphere was already thick with a kind of nervous energy that only emerges when people feel a power structure starting to dissolve beneath them. Colleagues I hadn't spoken to in months suddenly popped their heads out of offices to smile too brightly, wave too eagerly, or drop a passing comment that tried to thread at the impossible needle between familiarity and deference. "Hey Claire, big day, huh? Amazing stuff out there," someone chirped, a junior manager whose name I only remembered because he once tried to mansplain a pitch deck I had authored myself. I gave a polite nod, didn't slow my pace, and watched out of the corner of my eye as he immediately ducked back into his office, probably kicking himself for not saying more, or less. Inside my own office, I took my time settling in, powering up my laptop, sipping my coffee, and reviewing the dozens of emails flooding my inbox, like a river trying to breach its banks. There were congratulatory messages from people I barely knew, attempts to schedule catch-up meetings, vague offers of collaboration, and one particularly desperate note from a senior VP named Greg, who had just 2 weeks ago sat across from me in a strategy session and openly dismissed my proposal for being too cautious and not disruptive enough. His email read like a confession. "Claire, I think it's important we align our teams in light of the announcement. Your leadership here is essential, and I'd love to discuss how we can support your vision." It was almost touching, in a tragic kind of way, watching someone try to rewrite history in real time, hoping I wouldn't remember the way he smirked when I raised concerns about a campaign he later botched. But the most interesting response, unsurprisingly, came from the executive suite. Just after noon, I received an internal meeting invite titled Urgent Executive Strategy Alignment, sent by none other than David Mercer himself, with a CC list that read like a who's who of the company's leadership. The same people who, 48 hours earlier, didn't think my presence was necessary at a party meant for top performers. The irony wasn't lost on me. nor was the fact that every single one of them had accepted the meeting within minutes, a digital sign of how quickly fear can override arrogance when the right cards are played. Still, I didn't respond. Not yet. I let the invite sit there, untouched, a quiet reminder that I was no longer on their clock. And as the day unfolded, the tension only thickened. People began dropping by my office under the guise of casual conversation, asking vague questions about the deal, pretending to be curious or supportive, all while scanning my expression for some clue as to what might come next. I smiled, nodded, gave them nothing, because that was the plan, not to gloat, not to lecture, but to let them stew in the uncertainty they had once so confidently handed to me. Later that afternoon, as the building began to quiet down and most of the younger staff trickled out for their early happy hours, I printed 3 documents, clipped them neatly, and slid them into a leather folder that had been gathering dust on the bottom shelf of my office cabinet for nearly a year. It was a gift from a former mentor who had told me once, when I was still foolish enough to believe that hard work spoke for itself, that power isn't about raising your voice. It's about knowing when not to speak at all. I tucked the folder under my arm, stepped out into the hallway, and headed toward the executive wing. When I entered the boardroom, the chatter stopped almost immediately. Every chair was filled, and every face turned toward me with a blend of forced confidence and barely concealed concern. David stood to greet me, his smile polite but strained, and motioned toward the empty seat at the far end of the table. "Claire, glad you could join us. We were just reviewing some of the implications of yesterday's announcement. Amazing work, by the way. We'd love to get your insights." I didn't sit. I didn't even remove the folder from under my arm. Instead, I let a long pause settle over the room, long enough to let the discomfort grow legs and start pacing. Then I spoke. Once, clearly, deliberately. "Before we talk about insights, I think it's important you understand the scope of what's been signed, and the options still on the table." I saw shoulders tighten, pens were gripped. A few exchanged nervous glances, likely wondering what I meant by options. That's when I placed the folder down at the center of the table, unopened, and stepped back. "You'll want to read this before we continue." And with that, I turned and walked out. No explanations, no reassurances, just silence and the sound of my heels echoing against the marble floor. Let them wonder, let them chase, let them feel, for once, what it's like to be left outside the door while something important unfolds without them. There's a strange kind of stillness that settles over you in the hours after you've taken back a piece of yourself that you never should have had to fight for in the first place. Not the kind of stillness that signals the end of a battle or the close of a chapter, but something quieter and heavier. Like standing in the eye of a storm you created and knowing, with absolute clarity, that what comes next will not be about apologies, retribution, or even reconciliation, but about the space you now have to choose your own ending, an ending no one else gets to write. That night, after I left the boardroom with their questions still ricocheting off the walls and their panic only just beginning to bloom, I drove aimlessly for almost an hour, letting the city lights blur around me, not because I didn't know where I was going, but because for the first time in what felt like years, I didn't need to be anywhere unless I wanted to be. I parked eventually, not in some grand location or symbolic place, but outside a tiny old diner tucked between 2 shuttered storefronts on a side street most people had long forgotten. It was the kind of place with cracked vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like burnt hope, but I liked it for the same reason I liked silence, because it made no demands. The waitress didn't recognize me, which was exactly what I needed. She handed me a laminated menu without looking up and poured me a cup of that bitter, oversteeped coffee, and I sat there for a long while, fingers curled around the mug, replaying every moment from the past 72 hours like frames in a film I hadn't realized I'd directed. The folder I had left on the boardroom table was never about shocking them with secrets or threatening to walk away, though it certainly contained enough leverage to do both. Inside were the full terms of the licensing deal, a detailed roadmap of the implementation timeline, and most importantly, a list of contingencies I had quietly negotiated with the partner company, outlining exactly what would happen if my leadership within the firm was not given official contractual authority over the deal's rollout and long-term strategy. It wasn't a threat, and I had been careful not to frame it that way. It was simply a reality. If they wanted the future that this deal promised, they needed to understand that I was no longer a background player they could loop in after the fact or dress up for investor presentations. I had built this deal from the ground up, and I wasn't going to let it be another thing they twisted into a trophy for their own shelves. When I returned to the office the next morning, the mood had shifted again, this time from tension to tentative reverence. There were no more casual greetings, no chirpy invitations for coffee, only the slow, quiet acceptance that I now held something they couldn't afford to lose. David called me into his office before noon, and this time there was no smug grin, no condescension buried under fake praise. He stood when I entered, gestured towards the seat across from his desk, and began with a sentence I never thought I'd hear from his mouth. "Claire, I think we owe you more than just an apology." And here's where I surprised even myself. I didn't gloat, didn't lean back and revel in his discomfort, didn't ask for anything he wouldn't have offered on his own. I simply listened, let him lay out the new role he was proposing, Senior Executive Lead of Innovation Strategy, reporting only to the board, full autonomy on all product expansion initiatives, a compensation package that would finally match the value I'd been delivering for years. And when he was done, I nodded once and said, "Put it in writing." Because that was the new rule. No more hallway promises, no more vague commitments. Everything had to be documented, formal, and real. But the part of the story that no one talks about, the part that lingers long after the headlines fade and the LinkedIn likes stop rolling in, is what happens when you get exactly what you wanted, only to find yourself standing in a room you spent years trying to enter, wondering if it still feels like victory. Because the truth is, it didn't, not exactly. It felt like clarity, maybe even justice, but not joy. And maybe that's the real ending here. Not fireworks or revenge or some glorious speech in front of the people who once dismissed you, but a quiet, honest reckoning with the fact that the table you spent so long trying to sit at was never really yours to begin with. And maybe it never needed to be. A few weeks later, after the dust had settled and my new title had been etched onto the website and business cards had been reprinted, I hosted a meeting, not in the boardroom, not in the glass-walled executive lounge they had finally started inviting me into, but in a smaller conference room on the second floor, the one most of the VPs considered beneath them, the one where the support teams usually held their early morning scrums. I invited exactly 7 people, none of them executives, none of them department heads, just folks who had quietly done exceptional work for years without ever being recognized. I laid out coffee, pastries, and a few folders, and I said, "This is the new table. If you've got ideas, this is where they start." They looked at me like I was kidding, and when I didn't smile, they understood. That was my revenge, not in tearing down the old guard or parading my triumph, but in building something better, brick by brick, far from the fragile egos and the glass walls that had once tried to shut me out. I don't know if that makes me a hero or just another person trying to survive the slow, brutal erosion of corporate loyalty. But I do know this. When they told me I wasn't invited, they were right. That celebration wasn't for me. It was for people playing a game I had never truly belonged to. So I stopped asking for a seat, and I built my own damn table. Whether they come sit at it or not, that's their choice, but this time, the rules are mine.